As the Season 9 PTR comes to a close, there's been a lot of conversation about balance in Diablo 4, whether or not the game is in a good place, what they need to add to the game, what they need to do. But I think that what the majority of the player base tends to wrestle with is itemization, getting gear, masterworking, and basically everything that goes along with it. And basically, what I wanted to do is just give y'all some data. And maybe let's go ahead and have a conversation about it. Because what does it really mean to take a character that goes from base gear or even just base ancestral gear up to gear with triple masterwork crits, perfect masterwork crits, multiple mythic unique items, and even multiple GA items? How important is it really to get your gear up to the next tier? How much does 4 out of 12 or 12 out of 12 masterworking really impact everything? And at the end of the day, does any of it really matter? Well, let's go ahead and look at the data. For the purposes of this analysis, I took our Bonespear Necromancer guide here on Max Roll. This is shaping up to be the strongest build walking into Season 9, and is currently our strongest build in Season 8. And I took the basic build and I basically deconstructed it, bringing it all the way down to item power 750, and then building it all the way up to perfect gear. Bringing it up to ancestral levels of gear with a greater affix, masterworking that gear all the way up to 12 out of 12, with that being perfect outcomes every time. And then I actually took another interesting point of analysis, but I'm sorry I have to do this to you. I'm going to include it at the end for the people who are really nerdy and want to see it. But I promise you, I'm not here to just bait you into watching a video if you don't need to. Bare minimum, you could just go ahead and take a look at this right here. And if you feel like you can already understand what these numbers mean, there you go. That's basically the difference. But we're going to keep these same skills. We're going to keep Paragon all the way with maximum points spent, and with Paragon glyphs all the way up to level 100. I could technically do this analysis across every single level of every single glyph and how many points you would have at that point. And while that is interesting to do, and if you'd be interested in seeing a video like that, let me know down in the comments if you want to see the difference between having different glyph levels. But in reality, it turns out that your Paragon, your glyphs, and even the aspects on your gear aren't really the major contributors to how much damage you get by increasing the quality of your gear. Because when your amulet can say multiple passive skills, your items can have chance to cast twice or skill ranks on them themselves, as well as very powerful passives even on your two-handed weapons. There are a lot of places where you gain a ton of damage just from very slightly increasing the effects of these stats. The big things to understand is that the difference between a 750 item power and an 800 item power weapon is that they are going to have different base scaling of their damage. Obviously, the skill that I have, which is Bone Spear here, as well as its skill damage, are going to increase as we get additional ranks. Bone Spear has multiple facets to its damage, including the shards that spit out of it, as well as echoes from Deathless Visage. So I had to include those here just so you get a better understanding of how impactful those things are when you increase things like chance to cast twice. There is the total damage that the skill will do on average, the bonus that we get from our core stat of intelligence, our total additive damage, which I had to painstakingly calculate every single time I changed one of the stats. Those are all the different lists over here of me doing that. There's also your attack speed, which ends up being one of the biggest contributors to your damage increase overall whenever we're talking about a core skill or a skill without a cooldown. And then what is actually the largest total contributor to your total damage output are actually your passive skills and your enabler skills, or like setup skills. But what do I mean by that? In your skill tree, there are a lot of different nodes that say increase your damage. And while a 1.2 multiplier doesn't sound like a big number, if I instead reread this as increase your total damage by 20%, and you understand that's a multiplier, you can see how these add up fairly quickly. Perfectly Balanced is 20%, Supernatural Blight is 20%, Titan's Fall, one of our biggest contributors, is another 48% increase in damage. Even things like Fueled by Death is another 12% here. And while your aspects do contribute a lot, like on this build, aspects contribute a 15 times total damage increase here. The glyph multipliers are about a 3 times multi, Paragon multipliers are a 3.7 times multi. And we always overpower, we always crit, and we always get vulnerable. So that's another 50, 50, and 20. And the only other thing to understand before we get into the nitty gritty here is that I ignored 3 different systems. One, I didn't include your mercenary because it's just kind of hard to argue whether or not you can or cannot expect perfect uptime on your mercenary multipliers. And Variana will like always grant you attack speed, but you will only have the cover fire from Subo every once in a while. So we just kind of ignored those. Secondly, I ignored rune words. Rune words are very impactful, but rune words are not impacted by increasing the quality of your gear, not in a direct one-to-one causal loop there. The Cax rune word is just going to double your damage when you trigger it for 1 second. That doesn't really matter if your gear is better or worse. And then lastly, I didn't include elixirs as well as incense because that would pretty drastically change the output of a build depending on whether or not it cares about overpower, since you can get so much more maximum life. And not only that, you could technically optimize your build around the fact that an elixir will grant you lucky hit chance or attack speed or crit chance. But at that point, we're talking about something that I think 99.999% of players just aren't engaging with. Sorry for the costume change, it got way too hot. But let's go ahead and start talking about these numbers in meatier detail, because I think that the breakdown here is really valuable for you as a player to understand. Let's start looking at the 750 gear. We have a base weapon damage, we have a certain amount of scaling based off the skill, we're attacking once every 21 frames, which is slightly slower than 3 times per second, but it's fairly close. We have a decent amount of scaling from our passives. Our passives are multiplying our damage by 90 times. This is not 90% increase in damage, this is 90 times your total damage. That seems wild, but it's true. Book of the Dead is granting us a 3.6 times multiplier in total. Aspects are granting us a 15 or nearly 16 times multiplier. And what that means is that if you were to cast your Bone Spear nearly 3 times per second, at this point in the game, you would be outputting 34 billion DPS. Now again, no rune words, no mercenary, no incense or elixirs, but I think the mass majority of people at item power 750 probably aren't seeing this kind of output, but that's just kind of what happens when you have an overpowered build that's working at maximum efficiency. Now, when we bump up to item power 800, the only real difference here is that we gain a greater affix, which is definitely impactful, right? We go from having a 32% chance to cast Bone Spear twice, all the way up to a 48.8% chance. We're basically double casting on Bone Spear every other cast. And even just like that one difference is a fairly substantial increase in damage. Just as a straight comparison there, the damage difference of the skill itself, going from 750 to 800, you go from having a skill total damage of 4,000 as a base, upwards to nearly 5,000. That's almost a 20% increase in damage just from bumping everything up and getting that double cast up that much higher. We start to see that we're getting more all stats, we're getting more attack speed, meaning that we're approaching hitting a better breakpoint. And the biggest contributor here is we're starting to get more passive skills. Tides of Blood here is getting additional rank on our weapon. While our weapon is going to have a greater affix on intelligence, Titan's Fall is going to be a big contributor here. And then obviously your amulet. To start off, a GA on your intelligence is going to be the biggest increase in damage, but we have these 2 passive skills that as we begin to masterwork are going to start gaining a lot of additional ranks, basically for free. The difference between that same build, if all it had was item power 800 or ancestral gear with a single optimal greater affix on it, is a whopping 54 billion damage, which ends up being a 59% increase in damage. That's highlighted here in green. So going from 750 to 800, just gaining that one affix across all your gear, as well as the base damage of the weapon increasing by about 13% or so, is a 59% increase in damage. This is why the majority of build guides and any YouTube tutorials that you're using are recommending at least getting a greater affix weapon as soon as possible, as well as finding ancestral versions of gear. The other great part about ancestral gear is that you can actually masterwork it all the way up to 12 out of 12, as opposed to non-ancestral gear, which can only masterwork all the way up to 8 out of 8. So you're going to get another Masterwork crit out of it, bare minimum, 3 more upgrades of just your base stats with 5% each time, and just a bigger range or a bigger potential for what the gear is ultimately going to be able to give you. When we bump up to the 4 out of 12 version of this gear, so just getting that first Masterwork crit, again, on an optimal stat, but we continue to see the increase of all of our other stats too. We're getting more blood attack speed in our tempers. That number is finally going up. We're going to be gaining, smaller stats that aren't as consequential, but are typically relevant. More movement speed on your boots for free, more armor from your gear for free, so it's easier for you to be able to hit your caps, better cooldown reduction on various stats, even things like Enderas. You're going to get more maximum life, which is just making you sturdier, as well as more overpower, more damage reduction if you happen to drop down into injured, which isn't really a thing, but kind of relates to people, especially if they're struggling in the early game. And we start talking about getting those Masterwork crits onto our passive skills. So the difference between a 4 out of 12 Masterwork set of gear versus that same set of gear without that Masterworking at all bumps you up to 82 billion damage, which is another 51% increase in your damage output. Now, that probably doesn't immediately make sense. How is it that just doing this single step of item progression is another 50% total increase in damage? You take your total amount of damage, you're now doing more than 50% more. But it just turns out that these bonuses are going to continue to stack. It kind of snowballs from here, because as all of the numbers get bigger, increasing them further just gets them bigger but faster. Now we start talking about the place where, at least for me, I only really make sure that I get 8 out of 12 on the stat that I want, and then I don't care about my last masterwork at all. Maybe that says a lot about the current system in the game. But let's talk about that 8 out of 12 gear. 8 out of 12, 2 masterwork crits on the perfect outcome here. You see we're at nearly 75% chance for our Bone Spear to cast twice. But not only that, now that we're up to 8 out of 12, you'll see that we're starting to get some additional skill ranks for free. Bone Spear just naturally jumps up to 10 ranks to Bone Spear as opposed to 8. That's just kind of how 5% increase over 4 ranks is going to do you. Even more all stats, even more max life. Your attack speed is finally going to hit a higher breakpoint at this time. Your base tempers, even without masterworking into them at all, are starting to gain more traction. Your amulet's going to start having even more passives on it. Your weapon's going to have even more passives on it. Not only that, you get more attack speed from one of your tempers. You get more base intelligence, more maximum life. The build just gets stronger and stronger. The difference between 8 out of 12 gear and 4 out of 12 gear is even more substantial. We're now doing 146 billion damage, and that is a 78% increase in damage. We go from gaining nearly 60% increase down to only 51% increase. The funny part about that is because, again, 800 you get the higher base weapon damage, which is the leading contributor there. But the single GA on gear is already a fairly big increase. But when we're talking about 8 out of 12, we're talking about a 78% increase in comparison to the last masterwork progression point. That's why getting up to at least this point is so important. Your build's doing nearly double the damage at this point, depending on whether or not you're below pit tier 100 or above pit tier 100. It's like another 2 to 4 pit tiers. But what about perfect gear? This is triple masterworks on the most important stats, as well as sometimes splitting up your masterworks between different stats to be able to hit different total bonuses. At what point does your perfect gear impact your build? How much more damage are you getting? The answer is another 78% increase in damage. This one actually really caught me by surprise. We go from doing 146 billion damage per second up to 261 billion damage per second. That is a trillion damage every 4 seconds, actually a little bit more. That is insane. It is another 78% increase in damage. And here's where I think the comparison becomes the craziest. And I promise you, I didn't swap around the stats to make this happen, but quite literally, the difference between perfect gear and item power 750 gear is doing 666% more damage. That's bananas. That is wild. That is absolutely insane. The difference between starting off with the gear on your journey that is fully functional, like you're hitting the appropriate breakpoints, everything is working as intended, versus getting to the end of the masterworking journey on each piece of gear is a 7 times damage output increase. You versus your own build, 7 times stronger. It's like 7 of them were all attacking simultaneously while you just held down the right click button. And I think that really starts to paint an interesting picture. But remember, I promised you there was additional analysis for the super nerds who wanted to see something that you probably will never accomplish, but what does it mean if you would? Because I answered the question of what if you had perfect gear? How much of an increase in damage is that? But this is perfect gear with only a single GA on it. What if you hit perfect cell mode from the DBZ saga and you got legit 100% GAs, 4 GAs on every unique, 4 GAs on every mythic, 3 GAs on every legendary piece of gear, more skill ranks, more intelligence, more maximum life, more additional passives? What does that look like? How much stronger do you get? If you were to have perfect masterwork gear with full GAs across all of it, in comparison to the previous perfect gear, funnily enough, it's only about a 30% increase in damage. You go from doing 260 billion to 345 billion. So now you only have to attack for 3 seconds to basically hit that 1 trillion mark as opposed to 4 seconds. That's kind of funny. I actually thought this was going to be significantly larger. I thought this was going to be like astronomically larger. And this just kind of points to the fact that when we're optimizing builds, at least how we built it out on Maxroll, We're trying to capture not only the best possible output, but something that is almost realistic for you yourself to do. Like, sure, triple masterwork critting on chance to cast Bone Spear is strictly the best outcome on this piece of gear, and if you could get it, you would strive for it. But looking down at the gloves here, just managing to get 3 masterwork crits across attack speed in general between cap 1 and cap 2, your base attack speed and your blood attack speed, this is something that most people can fairly typically expect to accomplish. But when we're talking about perfect cell gear, where it also has triple GAs on every single legendary piece of gear, and even your mythics are quad GA, this is insane levels of item progression, stuff that you basically should never experience getting ever. And while in the intro of this video, I showed you my Indira's memory that actually had GA across Tides of Blood, Maximum Life, and the overpower damage, that was after running hundreds of Belials. It was an insane amount that we did this season. But I do think that it's very interesting to point out that the difference in literally perfect gear versus starter 750 gear is a 10 times damage increase. You are doing more damage than 10 of this build if you can literally get perfect, no notes versions of the gear that you want. Now, I truly think that there's a large discussion to have around how Masterworking currently works in the game. I personally think that you should be able to reset down to at least one of the checkpoints, so 4 out of 12 or 8 out of 12, as opposed to having to fully reset when you get to 12 out of 12 and it turns out you missed that 3rd crit. But I do think that there's one other question that's like kind of interesting to ask at this point, which is, should this much of our power really be locked behind gear? And is this the best way to incentivize players to participate with all the different systems in the game? I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that, but I did come up with some interesting observations based off of my findings here. The first one is that the biggest contributors to our damage in order goes your passive skills, so on your amulet as well as Titanfall on your weapon, or any passive skills that you might have on unique items. Your skill damage percentage itself, so literally more ranks in the skill that you're doing damage with. Your core stat, how much intelligence we have on the Necromancer. Then your attack speed, how fast are you attacking, and then additive damage. I do think that's very interesting that we see this progressively increasing amount of additional damage from progressing our gear further and further until we start talking about the literal perfect gear. And that perfect gear really highlights something that's kind of interesting here, which is that simultaneously a legendary piece of gear can never compare to a unique piece of gear, but unique pieces of gear actually have like very inconsequential stats on them. And I think it's kind of funny that they're both near infinitely more powerful than any other gear that you can get, while also having this outcome. If you look at my character, I have 1366 armor, and this is without incense or whatever. I quite literally can't get less armor. I took every single armor node and every single resistance node that I didn't need to take out of my Paragon and redirected them all into intelligence to increase my damage. Because in the Paragon, we also already take every single additive damage source as well. It just turns out that additive is very inconsequential when overpower grants you as much additive as it does. And even then, when you finally hit maximum Paragon, there's nowhere else to put your points. The last 50 to 60 points just kind of don't matter. And I think it sucks that the only real leveling or deterministic progression system that we have outside of our skill tree, which is Paragon, kind of doesn't matter for the last quarter of it, the last fifth of it. And I don't think that there's any system that should be able to say, you know, these points don't matter, so we don't want people to experience FOMO, but it also means that they just aren't valuable. There should be no system that has to say that to be valid. And then the other really big insight from this is just how many multipliers are available on pieces of gear that probably shouldn't have multipliers on them in the first place. And if you look at the legendary counterparts to them, they just don't. Indira's Memory gives you maximum life, which is a multiplier for overpower from your additive damage. Overpower additive damage itself gives you Tides of Blood, which is ranks to our strongest passive. And then it also grants you a multiplier from using an ultimate skill. Not only that, it adds on the tag of Bone Spear being a blood skill, which lets it scale with a bunch of stuff. And then also makes it so that Bone Spear will auto-eat corpses to automate Flesh Eater. And then also makes it so that your Bone Spears will cast more Bone Spears. That's like a 10 to 15 times increase in damage when you do all the math and how that interacts with echoes from Deathless Visage and the splinters from the shattering effect of Bone Spear itself. Just from our pants. Pants probably shouldn't say that. Similarly, armor probably shouldn't say gain +1 passive when passives are by far our largest contributor to our damage increase, just bare minimum. And maybe the helmet isn't where you say increase your damage by 60% and give you echoes which do 40% of base damage and double your chance to cast Bone Spear and 12 ranks to Bone Spear. Maybe armor should give survivability stats. And offensive gear, like your weapons and your amulet and rings, and maybe your gloves, I'm kind of on the fence with this one too, shouldn't say defensive stats. You should have to balance your gear across what those gear pieces would typically grant you. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. Go ahead and toss a like on and leave a comment down below. Also, if you're new here, subscribe to the channel. I don't know if other channels are bringing you this level of analysis or interesting thought pieces on how itemization, gear progression, and just Diablo 4 works in total. But if you're not finding it anywhere else and you are finding it here, go ahead and click that button. You don't want to miss out on any of it. Let me know down below, though, is this good? Is this a good thing? Is it good that this is the way that items work? Are you hoping to see something different as the seasons continue to progress and we ultimately move into the expansion of Diablo 4? And just kind of like, what are your general thoughts on itemization, on masterworking, etc.? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.